G'day mates and mateettes, it's Cunt and I'm back to tackle one of Ken Ham's lectures. The full thing is a monstrous hour and 15 minutes, and in the effort of not boring you to death and subjecting you to my horrible editing skills and poor mic quality, I'm working on it, more than is necessary, I'll chop it up into logical parts. The first of which is centered on Ken Ham's lack of understanding of how DNA works. DNA is a famously misunderstood molecule by creationists, so I'll do my best to help you understand what the science of DNA really is and not how Mr. Ham misrepresents it. So, without further ado, let's see how Ken Ham's knowledge stands up to a high school education and the power of Google.
So today, the topic today is science confirms the Bible.
Science confirms the Bible, does it? Well, not to be that arsehole, but isn't that like the most stupid fucking position to take? Ever. We all know when you say the Bible, you mean Genesis, because it's the only portion that you've actually read, so I'm not going to point out the very easy flaw in that statement that raising the dead and miraculous healings aren't exactly at the forefront of medical science. But Noah's flood and the Genesis creation story are two areas that disagree hugely with the scientific consensus. Any intellectually honest person would admit that. This fuckwit, however,
And it's to give you just a little overview of using apologetics to show how apologetics and with biology and geology and astronomy and so on confirms the Bible's history. And basically the message of the Creation Museum and the Ark is if the history in the Bible is true, then the gospel based in that history is true. I mean, that's really what we're on about. Our main emphasis as a ministry is to proclaim the authority of the Word of God and the saving gospel.
You dumb cunt! You can't just say that because the history is accurate in the Bible, which it's not, but I digress, that the gospel of the Bible is also true. That's not how source analysis works, or the scientific method. Here's an example. The video game franchise Assassin's Creed has some aspects of accurate history in it that can be empirically demonstrated. It cannot, however, be used to therefore demonstrate that there has been a millennia-long conflict between assassins and Templars. It's a non sequitur that even you, in all your dumb fuckery, should be able to get through your thick fucking skull.
I specifically want to talk about this because here's a phenomenal piece of evidence that cries out to all of us that God created. DNA is that molecular heredity that makes up our genes, our chromosomes. You know, it has all the information that builds a dog or a cat or an elephant, a human being.
All the information that builds all living things. True enough, but you are covering up some of the less God-implying parts of DNA. Your oversimplification of what DNA does warrants some expanding. DNA encodes for proteins, which then perform some function, or no function for that matter. A portion of DNA that is responsible for making a particular protein, and other areas such as the promoter region, which begins the process by which DNA is quote-unquote read, is referred to as a gene. There can also be thousands of DNA letters between each portion of DNA that is used to actually make the protein. There are genes which encode for RNA molecules, and they are not used to make proteins, but they aren't really relevant to Mr. Ham's argument, it's just nice to know that they exist. Located in genes that are used in the making of a protein or RNA molecule is a tremendous amount of non-coding DNA. I won't call it junk DNA because there is still a percentage that is used in regulating what proteins are made and when, but there is still a large portion that is just evolutionary gibberish. Now that long-winded explanation was partly to save you the trouble of being drip-fed this information over the next couple minutes because that would make it even harder to understand than it already is. But this is also to point out that the fantastic complexity of this little molecule doesn't at any point imply God. In fact, it would be far more efficient if we just had a string of genes necessary for each different cell that could be controlled and be read in one go. This string could include duplicates of genes, depending on what ratios the particular cell required different proteins in. This would be a far more efficient design if God is making everything. Or maybe God could make it so proteins were formed as the DNA was being read, instead of requiring the extra step of creating what's called mRNA. This would all be better design than the complex and failure-prone way that DNA works. Unfortunately, Ken didn't think of any of this, and my video isn't over.
And you know, it's interesting, DNA was discovered by two famous scientists in England, Francis Crick and James Watson. They were both atheists, and they discovered the helical structure of DNA back in 1953.
It is true that both Crick and Watson were ardent atheists, with Watson even stating that he was motivated to science because of his feelings towards religion. However, it is slightly disingenuous to call them the discoverers of the double helical structure of DNA. The woman who made the X-ray images of DNA that were used without her knowledge by Crick and Watson to create their model of DNA was Rosalind Franklin. Due to her early death, Franklin was never credited for the discovery of DNA's double helix, but she was acknowledged as the progenitor of that model by both Crick and Watson, despite Watson previously dismissing her in his book, The Double Helix. Fun fact about Franklin was, she was Jewish, which I'm sure will be a bit of an issue to Ken as he tries to nail home his gotcha atheist speech, which is undoubtedly coming.
Watson and Crick, when they discovered the helical structure of DNA, they put together this model. In fact, this is the original model that they put together. It's in a museum in London. And you know what they announced to the world? They said, guess what we found? There's no God.
Oh, here it comes.
They said, as atheists, what they set out to do was to show that life is built on chemistry. Chemistry is just matter, that there is no God. This is the molecule of life. This is what makes life. DNA, there's no God, it's just molecule. Complex molecule, it's just molecule. Well, you know what's interesting? We've done a lot of research since then. And you know what we found? DNA is not just matter. You know what DNA is? It's actually a complex information system and a language system.
So apart from this science being pursued by a Jewish woman who I'm quite sure was not looking for a way to disprove God, making the DNA to language analogy does put Ken in danger of misrepresenting how DNA works. I'll just cross my fingers and tap my heels 3 times in the hope that he doesn't fuck it up.
See, to help us understand, here's a piece of rope that has red and blue beads on the rope, and those red and blue beads spell out the word help. You all agree with that? Not sure? If you know the Morse code, they spell out the word help. If you don't know the Morse code, you have red and blue beads on a rope.
Oh, for fuck's sake, I knew this would fucking happen. The DNA code is what is known as degenerate or redundant. That means that there are multiple different DNA triplets that encode for the same amino acid. To simplify that, the specific arrangement of A's, C's, G's, and T's in DNA will control what the arrangement of A's, C's, G's, and U's are in the RNA that is then produced when the DNA is read. Each grouping of 3 letters, called codon, corresponds to a specific amino acid, as you can see on this chart here. These amino acids are then joined to make a protein. This is still a simplification of the science, but at the very least, it explains why Morse code is a poor analogy for codons. Look at the amino acid that the codon UUA produces, then look at the amino acid that CUC produces. They're the same, which means that in the Morse code analogy, each letter should have multiple different dot and dash combinations to produce the same letter. This redundancy found in the genetic code makes the cell's ability to read the information in the genetic code a lot less impressive and a lot less indicative of a designer. In fact, it increases the chance that each amino acid will be created, thus making evolution a lot more probable.
Okay, so in a sense, you think about it, we could write the entire Bible on a piece of rope using those beads, if you know the Morse code. Be a long piece of rope, but you could actually do it. But that's what I want you to understand, is that the beads, when they're arranged into a particular order and you know the language, you can get the information that's there, the word help. But you've got to have the information and you've got to have the language to read it.
Having the language and the ability to read that language are basically the same thing for DNA. Because A's and T's/U's fit together, and C's and G's fit together, think jigsaw puzzle, the language can be read by every cell. Every time the DNA code is read, it's like a toddler sticking 2 puzzle pieces together and seeing if they fit. Not exactly a process that requires a god.
DNA is sort of like that. As an analogy, DNA is like a couple of pieces of rope and has these beads on it, these molecules, base pairs. You don't have to worry too much about that. And they spell out all the information on how to build a human being, how to make your heart and your brain and your kidneys, all the engineering diagrams, all of the biochemistry, all the chemical pathways, incredibly complex. It's like a whole library of books with all this information in them.
Uh-huh. As long as we can agree that that library is just a bunch of schematics that require you to copy each book out and then cut out a tremendous amount of gibberish, gluing the bits you need back together. And you had to start at the beginning of each book each time you required that schematic and could never skip the gibberish. What a fantastic design. How perfect a molecule. Dumb fuck.
And you know, it's interesting. When I went to university, my professor did an experiment. He said, look, I'm going to show you that there's no God and that life could arise by natural processes. He said, let's take the letters of the alphabet and put them in a hat. One of the things I didn't ask is, where did the letters come from?
You see, the letters come from single base substitutions, frameshift mutations like insertions and deletions, and block mutations where a series of nucleotides are inserted, deleted, or substituted. Some of these mutations affect the code more than others, but the basic principle is that DNA can easily be changed in many ways. The formation of the first DNA or RNA nucleotides is still a topic of research, with many different hypotheses on how it first emerged. Fun fact though, because it's such a volatile area of science, nothing about abiogenesis is actually taught in the Victorian curriculum. So unless you want to use your fucking god calc on these gaps, I would be careful about calling this evidence for a creator.
But we'll ignore that. Okay, so we put them in a hat, and then he passed the hat around the class and said, I want you by chance to pull out letters. And 3 students in a row pulled out B-A-T. Ah, we got a word. Bat. Given enough time, we could get more words. Given enough time, we could actually think about it, even though it seems remote, but you could get sentences. Given enough time, you could get the Encyclopedia Britannica. See, you don't need God. It just so happened that millions of years ago, in just the right conditions, at the right time, the right molecules came together, DNA, life, bang, it all evolved. There's no God.
Or do I sense an argument for incredulity, Ken? Just because it is improbable that we exist does not make it impossible. If I had you shuffle 4 decks of 52 playing cards, the order you created would have a 1 in 4.232467 times 10 to the 271st power chance in being produced. Yet you still created that order, didn't you? Yes, Ken, you hit the nail on the head. The right molecules came together, DNA, life, bang, there is no God. That's the preschooler description anyway.
You know what I didn't ask my professor at the time? That word BAT, is it a BAT to a Dutchman or a Chinese or a Japanese, or who's it a word to? You realize it's only a word to somebody who has a language? See, if you look at my Bible here, it's in English, but if this Bible was in Russian, I wouldn't be able to read it because I don't know Russian. It needs to be in English, and I need to know the English language to read this, okay? You know, the other interesting thing is that I can read this and get information, but the information is really not on the page. Actually, the information comes because there's ink arranged into letters that are arranged into words that are arranged into sentences, and because I have the language, I can read that and get the information, but actually information is immaterial. See?
Remember how I said the language of DNA is basically that different components fit together like a jigsaw? Well, that holds true here. You mentioned the double helical structure of DNA earlier. That structure can only form as a result of the A's, C's, G's and T's fitting together like a puzzle. So the structure of DNA is also the mechanism by which it is read. There was never a need for cells to learn the language of DNA because it's read in an analog fashion. If there is a GCU codon, then a CGA anticodon will be the only possible fit to that piece of the jigsaw, and the amino acid alanine that is attached to that anticodon will be added to the protein. This isn't immaterial like language can, where we are matching a sound to what we interpret that sound to mean based on learned knowledge. This is a universal mechanism that is about matching complementary shapes and finding the amino acid associated with them. Nothing is interpreted and nothing is learned. The process is entirely material.
This is getting heavy. All right? So what I want us to understand is this. You can't read the word help without the language. Actually, DNA is like that. You realize that DNA is like all this information, but you know what else? You've got to have the language to read DNA, so DNA itself has the information to make the language to read the DNA.
He's talking about RNA polymerase. It's the protein that transcribes DNA into RNA, which can then be used to make the machinery for making proteins and the schematics for those proteins. While this does fall into the same category of things that we don't know given its direct link to abiogenesis, there are hypotheses on the subject, but I couldn't really do them justice here. From what I understand, the subunit eubacterial beta prime is seen as the most likely origin for this reading molecule. But the most honest answer I can give is, I don't know. Like with all things science, I would love to be corrected in the comments if I screwed that up. So, like I mentioned earlier, this is a shrinking gap, ripe to shove some god cock into if you're up for it, Ken.
It's all got to be there or it won't work. Now, Dr. Werner Gitt, who's a German scientist, he wrote a book called In the Beginning Was Information. And in that book, he says this: there is no natural law through which matter can give rise to information. Now, stop right there for a moment. Life is built on information. Do you know how many bits of information there are in living things on this earth? It's not millions. It's not billions. It's zillions. I mean, it is uncountable for us. The amount of information in DNA on living things on this earth is absolutely extraordinary. Do you know what Dr. Gitt is saying? There's not one instance where matter has ever produced one bit of information by itself.
The fuck is your definition of information? Going by the second definition listed on Google, the cosmic microwave background radiation is information that implies there was a Big Bang. We've observed that, haven't we? I guess the cosmic microwave background is technically energy, and your quote from Dr. Gitt does reference matter specifically. So how about our knowledge that the land masses today were once arranged in a supercontinent due to the way certain landmarks and fossils line up together? That's matter giving rise to information by the definition of the word. But no. You specifically mean that you, and Dr. Gitt for that matter, think that there is no possible way that DNA could have formed naturally. There are many hypotheses for the formation of the first nucleotides, but there is definitely a gap in our knowledge.
Wait a minute.
You're welcome to shove the god
According
cock
to
in,
evolution, matter had to
don't be
produce
surprised
information
when the
over
gap
millions
covers
of years.
over
You've got to get
and
all
your
this new
god can
information
no
to get the
longer fit
zillions
in.
of bits of information we have so that you can get all these new features and creatures and all the rest of it. Well, wait a minute. We've never seen matter produce one bit of information? That means life could not have arisen by natural processes. Not only that, he goes on and says this: a code system is always the result of a mental process. Matter by itself never produces a code.
Wait, what? You're taking the position that DNA itself cannot evolve? Can you get nothing right? Look, there are 3 categories of mutations that can occur in the genome. Nonsense mutations, which code for an early stop codon in the DNA code, leading to certain amino acids not being added to the protein. Missense mutations, which change the amino acid a codon codes for, and silent mutations that do nothing. This is possible due to the redundancy of the genetic code that I discussed earlier. How multiple different codons can code for the same amino acid. By definition, when either nonsense or missense mutations occur, information is added, though I assume you'd try to argue that a nonsense mutation reduces information, but that still leaves missense mutations. These mutations, because they cause different amino acids to be produced, will sometimes improve the functionality of a particular protein or change its functionality in a desirable way. Evolution by natural and sexual selection occurs, yada yada yada. To give a more colourful example, an article from Nature that you can find in the description observed bacteria evolving resistance and tolerance to antibiotics. The bacteria did not come with antibiotic resistance as an intrinsic part of their genome. Rather, the few that had the gene via mutation were the only bacteria that survived once exposed to antibiotics. Hence, new information was added to their DNA. I have a sneaking suspicion that your source, Dr. Werner Gitz, PhD in engineering, didn't cover biology all that well. Also, your quote that matter never produces a code is just a rehash of matter never creates information in a slightly more DNA-centric way. And it also suffered from the same faults that argument had, so well done, you've accomplished nothing.
You know, if you do computer programming, if you have random events on your code to disrupt the code, it destroys it. And if you just try to generate a code by random processes, it isn't going to work. You have to have a language to make it work.
You see, that's the beauty of evolution. It keeps what works and the rest dies. Plus, the redundancy of the genetic code means that most mutations won't even do anything but add junk to the DNA. You're dreaming if you think that your computer programming random events analogy works. There is no method by which features which are suited to the environment are conserved in computer programming. There is an evolution, and it's called natural selection. If it can survive to reproduce, then it must be working well enough. Where is that represented in computer programming?
And so you see, when you think about it, what evolutionists believe, they don't just believe that one kind of animal changed into another, they have to believe that matter produces information, and that originally matter produced information and a language system to form life, and over millions of years you produce more and more information to get the zillions of bits of information. People, you know what this really says? Evolution is ridiculous.
Look, I can forgive not understanding abiogenesis, but this is basic evolution. We can see the natural process that produced the information within us just by viewing our DNA. It is filled with broken and junk DNA that is entirely consistent with successive small mutations creating the diversity in life we see today. Just because you don't understand how DNA mutations work doesn't mean it's impossible. Jesus Christ.
It's absurd. No wonder the Bible says, if you don't believe in God, you're without excuse. DNA actually cries out to us, in the beginning God created. Isn't it exciting to be a Christian? Wow, 22 people excited. It's incredible. Isn't it exciting to be a Christian? Oh, that's better. We're getting better. Okay. Now, I was at one particular conference and somebody said to me, yeah, but wait a minute. You know, you Christians have a blind faith that there's God. Well, actually, no. No. It is a faith, but it's not a blind faith. You know who has the blind faith? The atheists. Richard Dawkins. You know why? Richard Dawkins says there's no God, which flies in the face of what we know from biochemistry about DNA.
Okay. Let's pretend that everything up to this point was not pure shit that you vomited out. This is still a long way off being evidence for your God. Even when I grant you the best possible scenario, you still failed to prove that it was anything but a creator.
So actually, when you look at DNA, it actually confirms in the beginning God. Doesn't prove it, because ultimately we can't absolutely prove these things because we're finite beings and we don't have all information. You know, that's why there's always going to be a faith aspect. Young people, I often have people, I go to churches or I teach in schools and they'll say to me, well, prove that there's a God. See, here's the thing. You can't ultimately, as a human being, a finite human being, prove those things in an absolute sense.
You do realize that the entire point of the scientific method is to remove the faith aspect, right? And proof is a relative term. The theory of evolution can be proven. That doesn't mean that there is no aspects which can be improved in order to better demonstrate reality. But I think that you are just attempting to obfuscate the burden of evidence with philosophical ramblings. Keep trying.
The point is, there's always a faith aspect. There always will be a faith aspect. But Christianity is not a blind faith. It's an objective faith that makes sense of what we see and is confirmed by observational science. Atheism is a blind faith.
Faith is to believe a claim without or even in spite of the evidence, whereas science attempts to describe objective reality. Your objective faith is A, not supported by the evidence, and B, based on a book that even if you were correct so far, would not have even been proven correct.
In fact, it's a faith that lacks credulity. It doesn't make sense. And then how do you explain the laws of logic? And how do you explain the laws of nature and the uniformity of nature, that the laws stay the same? How do you do that?
I'll tell you how in the next video. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope the audio and editing wasn't so bad that you couldn't stand to watch it. If I got something wrong, please tell me down in the comments. If you're feeling up to it, chuck us a rating and maybe even subscribe to see me grow and get my new content. For now though, I'm off. So I will see you next Thursday.